Hey everybody, good morning. Good to see you guys here. So we're about to get started. You know, it's May 1st, Friday. We have another key meeting today. We're finishing out the last notes on the philosophy of mind subject, and then we're going to start talking about a new topic next week. So making progress through our course. Just have a couple more things to get through. But welcome everybody if you're here now or if you're arriving soon or if you're watching it later. Welcome to everybody that's viewing this one. Okay, here we go. All right, great. Just got a little coffee here. Ready to get the day started. Okay, cool. A couple of the early morning folks here with me. Good to see you guys at any time. You know, just let me know that you're here. Feel free to say hello, give me a comment, a little chat, or whatever else. Say hi to Kitty. She's having a good morning so far. Hi, Kitty. This Kitty's just too much, huh? She had something on her mouth, so I just had to kind of get that. A few more minutes, it'll be 9. Got some landscaping people outside, so sorry for the leaf blower sound. I'm trying to muffle it as best I can with the windows and stuff, but it's a little bit audible, maybe, not too bad. She's a smart cat, I'm telling you. You know, I see footage and stuff like we all do. Cats on like, you know, they'll like look at like something on a TV and like kind of try to chase it and stuff as if they think it's, you know, really in the room. But she would never do that. Like, she just looks at like footage on a TV like she's just watching it. And I don't know, man. I'm telling you, it seems like she like recognizes her own image in the mirror because when she gets in there, she's not like you've seen some cats they'll like bat at the reflected image of themselves, like they think it's a different cat. You just kind of study yourself, kind of like look. Yeah, she's an amazing kitty. At least I would say so. I'm a little biased, clearly, but after 16 years, you know, you really bond. Go ahead, kitty. Thank you. Okay, little cameo from her. Okay. All right, just another minute. We'll get going. You'll probably tell I'm a big time beverage person. Always sipping tea, coffee. Not so much soda or anything, but gotta stay fully hydrated. One second. Okay, guys, it's pretty much 9 a.m., so welcome back, all you guys. Say hello. Let me see who's here. It's always a great thing to just kind of have a sense of the members that are attending. But hi, good morning. It's May. Congrats, you survived into May. So new month, new goals. Today, what we're doing is we're finishing up our topic of the philosophy of mind. Hi, Madeline, Emily. Good to see you guys. Good morning. So yes, we've reached the point in the semester today where we're going to close off one topic. Riley, Bella, good to see you guys. Good morning. So we have to go over the work of Alan Turing and his paper. Hey, Trevor. And then next week, we will launch the last subject of the semester, and we just have three meetings on that, or actually four, because there's one meeting on the following week that's a lecture. Marissa, hello to you too. So let's just go into it. Quickly though, I'll try to say for you guys what we covered last time. So we're engaged in the topic of the philosophy of mind. A significant debate within that whole realm is what's the nature of consciousness? Is it just something physical or is it not? Now, some people are physicalists. They say everything's made out of matter, consciousness too. It's basically brain states, which are physical things, neurophysical chemical states of the brain. That's all that consciousness is. Nothing spiritual or separate from physical reality. But then there's dualists who say there's both matter and mind, where mind is something that is not extended and yet has consciousness, but matter is essentially the result of all the atoms, which are little bits of extended space. Descartes was a dualist. He said you can imagine the mind and body existing separately, so they must be able to exist separately, since that's clearly conceivable, and clear and distinct things must be true according to the fact that God is not a deceiver. Then there was Daniel Stoljar, who pretty much wanted to defend physicalism, but also to clarify what it means. To say everything is physical means that everything supervenes on atoms, so that if you have like a large composite structure which is built out of these little atoms, the atoms completely govern everything that happens at the global feature level. So if you had, let's say, two different identical physical systems with the same arrangement of atomic facts, they would have to have the exact same global features too, including consciousness and thought and all the psychological aspects of life. So in two duplicate universes that are physically the same, they would not just be physically the same, they would be the same in every possible way. And then he also talked about the argument from causal closure and argument from methodological naturalism to give reasons to think that's actually true. And then last lecture, it was all about J.J.C. Smart. J.J.C. Smart, his real position is that sensations are brain processes. That means they're just physical things. If sensations are brain processes, by the way, sensations are just like mental states of any kind. If those are just brain processes, then physicalism would be true, because the only area where physicalism is challenged is in the arena of consciousness. So if it wasn't physical, the concept of the mind and consciousness, then it would be what he's calling a nomological dangler, something that remains unexplained by science. And generally speaking, scientists don't want there to be nomological danglers. Why should it be that the universe has some things that don't operate physically, but everything else does? That wouldn't, he thinks, make most sense. So he denies that it's a nomological dangler and thinks that consciousness is just a brain state. Now, having said that, he provides various objections to the claim, and then he tries to rebut the objections. One of the objections was, how could sensations and brain processes be the same thing? Because you can talk about your sensations, and that's easy enough, but you really cannot say anything clearly about what is going on in the brain. And if the two things are identical, shouldn't we just be able to switch modes, like talking about it as a brain process versus talking about it as a subjective experience? Since we can't do that, maybe they're not the same thing. But J.J.C. Smart says, not so fast. That's not a good objection, or it's not the best objection, because simply because there are two words or descriptions for something, that does not necessarily mean there have to be two things. Two words or descriptions can both refer to the same object, even if a person is not aware of that. And he gives the example of like the morning and the evening star, or lightning and electricity. In either of those two examples, we've got a pair of terms, but the two terms do not refer to separate things. They're just different labels for the same thing, or different ways of thinking about one and the same object. So he would say that's the same thing, which is true of sensations and brain processes. They're the same thing referred to by other terms, but there's not two things, just one, and it's a brain process. After that, he considers a couple of other objections that we just reviewed, like how could a sensation and a brain process be the same because the words don't have the same meaning? And yet again, he says, well, that's just a difference in language, but in physical reality, the two terms that have different meanings just refer to one object, and that's not something that is impossible. Another thing he mentioned was you could argue that sensations don't have a physical location, but brain processes do, so they can't be the same. And he also said there, well, they actually do have a physical location because sensation is just a brain process. We typically don't mention the physical location of it because there's no practical purpose to that, but it's literally true. And then at the end, last time, I just kind of talked to you guys about objection 7. That's Descartes' type of objection, which says that sensations couldn't be brain processes because you could imagine yourself having these sensations even if you had no body at all, therefore having no brain at all. But when J.J.C. Smart hears that objection, he says, well, I don't know, that sounds like a ghost theory of consciousness, like your consciousness arises from a ghostly substratum. But the brain theory is an alternative to that, and he would just argue that the brain theory of consciousness has more plausibility than the ghost theory. So much for our review of those topics, just kind of keeping our head in the game and remembering, where we've been and where we are at. So today we're finishing this subject with one last author, and the guy's name is Alan Turing. Sorry, different marker here. Okay, Alan Turing, he lived from 1912 till 1954. And in 1950, he wrote a paper that is considered a classic paper, and that's what we're talking about. The paper is called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Okay, Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence by Alan Turing from 1950. Have any of you guys ever heard of this man? This man's name, Alan Turing, maybe? If you have, that would be interesting to know. He's actually a very important person because he is the kind of forefather, architect, creator, if you will, of the digital computer. So, I mean, how important is that piece of technology, the computer, right? We're using it now. It's fundamental to modern life. You guys growing up in your particular generation cannot even remember a world that didn't have the internet, of course. I can barely remember that because I'm kind of old enough, but it has been around since the 90s, and so early memories I still have of using like old AOL and everything. But look, the computer, whether it's used for internet, whether it's used for word processing, creating computer models, video games, okay, Trevor, yeah, so you remember from the Imitation Game, I was going to mention this film. That's one kind of pop cultural touchstone of Mr. Turing's life that did bring in, I think, more widespread recognition. So he created the digital computer, and therefore we all, I think, owe a huge debt of gratitude for this established result. It's transformed all of our lives, and it's very deeply bound up with modern living. The thing, though, is the film you're referring to, Imitation Game. So there was a movie made about his life not that long ago, I think within the past 5 years or 6 years, and this movie Imitation Game is all about his life. It doesn't focus as much on his work in early computer programming and development of digital computers. It talks more about his work in another important area, which is that he was a code breaker for the Allies during World War II. So you can see his life spans over the era of the World War II conflict. And, so the Allies made, United States, Britain, and our other Western allies were fighting against the Nazis and the Axis powers. And one thing that was necessary at that point was to be able to intercept coded messages that the Nazis were exchanging so that you could prevent their attacks from being effective. And so he had to become very skilled in the ability to crack these codes and cryptographs, and that also supplied him with some of the insights that allowed him to generate these early computer programming languages. So he helped also, the Allies defeat the Nazis in World War II. So we can add that to his, resume of accomplishments, along with the invention of digital computer. So the thing also, there's a little bit of some darker aspects of his biography. Okay, so like in the time he lived, he was there was huge taboos against people being like openly same-sex orientation gay, right? And he actually was a gay person, and it was discovered. And at that time in Britain, where he lived as a British citizen, there were actually legal remedies that they would try to apply to people that were gay. So he was put into trial, and they actually ordered him to undergo a process of chemical castration, where basically he would have to take a cocktail of drugs that were supposed to like destroy his libido and his sexual drives and stuff. So I mean, obviously that's a sort of, I guess, stain on the legacy of the system within which he lived at the time. And then he died obviously pretty young. You can see only in his early 40s of cyanide poisoning, which officially is ruled as suicide. But some people wonder if there could have been a foul play element. Anyways, that's the life of Alan Turing. That's the biography facts. A very quick snapshot of it. And if you ever want it, you can watch the film. Benedict Cumberbatch, who portrayed him in the movie, actually won the Oscar for Best Actor, I believe, for his portrayal there. So, it's an interesting man and an interesting life, but we're interested in a different point that he discussed. So in this paper in 1950, he raises the question, could a computer ever think or have consciousness, right? So me and you have consciousness, that's clear. Question is, could a computer that we build as human beings, could those things ever also have consciousness like we have? Is that possible, or is that not possible? And Alan Turing, I don't know if it would strike you as a surprise or just to be expected, but he did believe, and he argued in this paper, that computers, machines, they will eventually have consciousness and be able to think, right? Yeah, so, well, Marissa, I don't know, it's kind of sad, isn't it, that people have had to experience those things, I mean, just for the way that they're born, or for the choices they make, either way. But to return to our main theme here, he's arguing that computers could have consciousness and that they could actually think. Now I want to ask you a little philosophical question. If computers or machines could have consciousness, suppose they could, what do you think that would tend to be more supportive of, physicalism or dualism? If we could build machines and computers that have consciousness on a par with human consciousness, do you think that would tend to be more supportive of the physicalist position or the dualist position? Wonder what you think. Because of course that's like looming in the background of all these discussions, physicalism versus dualism. If machines had consciousness, and we were able to sort of conclude that they did, would you believe that this means dualism or physicalism is gaining some additional support? What do you think? Okay, Trevor, so you're saying physicalist, I think, because computers are just transistors, on-off switches, just like neurons that fire. Good. And I like how you supplied the reasoning behind your answer, too. Also, good, Eric, seconding that. That's correct, I would say. If machines could think, then that, I guess, many argue, would be like a proof of the concept that consciousness can arise within a purely physical system. Because nobody thinks of a computer that you're, using as something with a soul, or like a ghost in the machine. So if consciousness could be generated from wires, transistors, chipsets, silica, just synthetic or derived components that we assemble, if consciousness could come out of something like that, then you might argue that that somewhat supports the idea that consciousness is merely based on physical things, because the computer is probably conceded by all to be just a physical object. And if consciousness can come out of a computer, then maybe the brain itself is just a very sophisticated type of naturally occurring physical system that creates consciousness. So we're like the organic computer that nature has evolved or whatever. And then these man-made artificial computing machines that we have created as people, if those could have consciousness, then I guess it would say consciousness is something that is entirely based on a physical basis. So let's get through it. Let's try and understand how he believes this is ever possible for machines or for computers to think. The way he says it is that you have to be able to, let's say, determine what kind of test would be necessary for computers to pass in order to judge them as conscious beings. And there's a specific way he thinks that we could evaluate whether computers or machines did have consciousness. So, but I wonder what you think. I mean, maybe we should hold off on the kind of questions about your own opinion, but does anyone have an opinion on that? Do you think it's possible in principle for computers to think, or that they could only imitate the behavior of thinking things and they actually would not have real consciousness? Like, imagine a future world like where your grandkids are really young and you're getting older, and there's full-on, we're not just talking about Siri and Alexa, like little voice assistants, but full-on Android cyborg type robots that you could just have friendships with and talk about your feelings with and go to concerts with, and they would like exhibit what appear to be emotional states, and they would exhibit conversational ability. Would you think that those would be real conscious beings at that future time, or that would just be a very sophisticated computer program without consciousness? This is a deep question. I guess it's something that maybe you'll have to think about or reflect on a little bit. Maybe this essay will help you to give the the considerations. Eric, you say you don't think we could ever create things that are conscious. Okay. Trevor, you saying absolutely. If we have such a deep, complex neural network in our brain, who's to say we can't make that same complex wiring in the form of transistors? So I like that. There's a kind of set of competing intuitions, and that's basically how philosophy works a lot of time. You can see the underlying rationale or basis for a set of different opposed positions. Well, let me tell you, what is Alan Turing's view? Alan Turing does believe that in the future, over time, as computing machinery becomes more sophisticated, as it develops better processing power, data speed, data storage, he thought it would be an inevitable, not really if, but when, that someday, at a certain time in the future, there will be thinking conscious machines. So he speaks as the inventor of the digital computer. So I guess he has a kind of insight, but we have to test his argument according to our own judgment. And so we're going to see what his best case argument is that computers could have consciousness. Trevor, you say it's the same on-off switch technically, technologically. It is the same on-off switch technology technically. I see what you mean. And then Marissa, you siding with Eric, but you're not so sure that's possible. Trevor, again, I feel it's less like trying to make it conscious and more like a brain. Yes, but the brain exhibits consciousness, so it's kind of all of a piece. It's a related concept for sure. Let's jump into it then. I think now we've got ourselves set up to really explore his reasoning now. Okay, so he thinks this. In order for us to determine whether a machine has consciousness, we have to put it through what he calls an imitation game. Okay? Now, I'm going to quickly talk to you about the version of the imitation game that was just used as like a little party game, not having anything to do with this deep philosophical question of whether computers could have consciousness or not. But he kind of repurposes certain elements of this party game for social gatherings to try and test whether machines have consciousness. Okay, so I'm going to draw the notes for the imitation game when we get to the real version that matters, because the initial description of it is just a setup for the test of computers having consciousness. But okay, in the imitation game, when it's played at parties and stuff just for fun, imagine this. Okay, so you have like a partition which separates one person from two other people. Now, the two people that are behind the partition, one is a man and one is a woman. And the individual who's on the separate side of the partition, who can't see those two people, has to then interview them. So we call the guy on the other side of the wall the interrogator, and then the two individuals that are on the opposite side of it are just the man and the woman. Now, he gets to interview the man and the woman by means of written, typed questions that he then gets written, typed responses back, okay? And here's the way that game is played. The man on the other side of the wall with the woman, when he gets interviewed, he's trying to deceive the interrogator so that that interrogator will come away thinking he's a woman. The woman is a woman, and so she just answers questions naturally like a woman would. But the man behind the wall is trying to, let's say, trick the interrogator into messing up the correct identification. Now, the interrogator's goal in the game is simply this. After he gets a set amount of time to interview the two subjects, like say 5 minutes, and he can ask any questions that he wants to each one. So it's like 5 minutes to person A, 5 minutes to person B. Then he finishes his interview sessions, and then he has to judge who is the man and who is the woman, based just on the nature of the answers that he gets back. Okay? Now, A is trying. The man behind the wall is trying to throw him off, so he wants him to misidentify. What counts as a win for the interrogator is if he can see through the deception and he gets it right and he correctly identifies the man as the man and the woman as the woman. So, like, for example, all he knows when he's doing the interviews is this is interview subject number 1, this is interview subject after that number 2, and then after he's considered the nature of their answers given back to him through text, he has to judge, was number 1 the man or woman, or was number 2? He knows 1 is a man and 1 is a woman, but he's not told in advance which is which. And therefore, at the end, the imitation game results in a win if he could tell that the one who was imitating the woman was actually the man. All right? Now, if you were the man on the other side of the wall playing this game, and questions are being given to you, what kind of answers do you think that the man is going to give in order to try and cause the interrogator to lose the game? What kind of answers would that man give to try and, defeat the interrogator in the game? Just think about that. He would he would respond with answers that he thought what? Just checking in with you, making sure that's clear. What do you think? What kind of characteristic responses would the male subject who's being interviewed provide in this game that he thought a woman would give? Exactly, right? So if the interrogator asks the question, what's your favorite movie? I don't want to engage in like gender stereotypes or anything, but of course the imitation game involves that. So the male subject would probably not want to reply with the most stereotypically masculine style movie, but instead one that he thought would be more susceptible to the interests of a characteristic feminine perspective. So he might be, like a romantic movie, Notebook, or something like that. Otherwise, maybe he gives himself away as the man. Now, why do you think that the interrogator is separated by a partition from the two interview subjects? That, I hope, is easy. It's because if you could just see them, then there would be no real game to play, because you could just obviously identify by means of sight. But it's supposed to be purely based on the content of the responses. And why are the messages and questions and answers sent and delivered via text? Because if you could just hear the voice, that would also be a giveaway. And it's supposed to be just based on the quality or content of the answers given. Okay, now, I told you that I was just going to mention the original party game version of the imitation game, but it's just a setup. Now we're really getting to our notes where it actually matters, because he repurposes that game as a way of testing whether machines have consciousness. And this is the imitation game, which is also sometimes called today the Turing test. It's been named the Turing test after him, obviously, because he didn't call it the Turing test, because he's Turing. But imitation game / Turing test, this is what it is. Okay, so you got your partition. Here you have an interrogator. On the other side, we have two individuals, A and B. Now, A is just a human, but B is a computer. Okay? So now, this is the actual version of the imitation game that matters for the purposes of this class and for Turing's purposes, of course. So it's not about who's the man, who's the woman. Now the game is played the same kind of way, but what do you think the interrogator's mission is in this version of Turing's test? The interrogator gets to ask questions for, let's say, a set 5-minute or 10-minute period. to either of the two individuals on the other side of the wall, and he's sending questions via written text, he's receiving answers via written text back, and he can't see the two subjects visually. After he talks to them both, he has to judge, what do you think? What's the goal or the objective of the interrogator? How does he win the game in this exact version of the game? He's trying to make what call? He's trying to judge which one was the computer and which one was the actual flesh and blood human being. So here's what Turing thinks. So let me be a little more specific. He wins the game if he correctly identifies the person as the person and the computer as the computer. So for example here, if he finished his interviews and he said, okay, my judgment is that A is the person and B is the machine, then in that case, that's a win. That means that the machine didn't really successfully trick him into thinking it was an actual authentic person. But he loses the game if he incorrectly identifies the two cases. So if he comes back and says, I believe that B was the human and A was the machine, then that's a loss. And what Turing says is, when we get to a point at some time where these interrogators cannot reliably distinguish who is who, so when they basically misidentify about half of the time, that rate of failure, he thinks, would establish that machines have consciousness and they're thinking things. So it's kind of like walks like a duck, talks like a duck, is a duck kind of thing. If this machine exhibits realistic enough human-like responses in a conversational interaction so that you cannot even tell the difference between was I talking to a robot or a human, he says that's when their behavior has become indistinguishable from human behavior, and so you should just suppose at that time these are conscious beings that have consciousness. So that's the Turing test. Why does he think that machines could have consciousness? Because he believes that at some point in the future, this metric will be passed. We will have sophisticated enough artificial intelligence that you just won't be able to tell the difference at all if you're talking on the phone with a robot or talking on the phone with a human. I don't know if I should say talking on the phone because that would give away the voice element, but at least in the initial version of the game, the wall makes sure that he's not judging just based on the superficial appearance characteristics of the two. Because whether a being's conscious or not shouldn't depend on whether it looks externally like a human being. Also, the reason that questions are sent and received through text is because it shouldn't matter the sound of a voice, whether a being has consciousness, just the nature of the responses that it gives. So if you were this interrogator and it was your, game to play, what kind of questions do you think you would ask to the two interview subjects to try and determine who is who? Like, what type of questions do you think you'd pose in an actual imitation game if you were put in the position of the interrogator there? Questions like what? For example, I don't know. What? What do you think? I mean, just, put yourself in that position. You're the interrogator. Now you got two interviews lined up, and your whole goal now is going to be to try and figure out of the two people I'm talking to, or two things that I'm talking to, which one is a human and which is a machine. So you might start off by asking things like, for example, what kind of questions could help you make that judgment call? I have a clear idea about what kind of questions might be asked. Okay, something only a computer would be able to answer. Well, the thing is, the computer's not trying to seem like a computer. I mean, it's not like if you ask, tell me like the 20 decimal places out in pi. If the computer just immediately said 3.114 blah, 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 then you'd be like, okay, clearly that's the computer. So, the programming of the computer is going to account for that. It's designed in order to be tricking you. So, I don't know, you might be able to ask that, but I'm sure that in a very sophisticated program, the computer's response would be like, I don't know, I mean, that's a lot of decimals. I have to look it up or something, like a human would say. But fair enough. I mean, I understand why you're thinking that. Trevor, you say, how about, are you a computer? And again, we're really getting only on the surface level here, Trevor. Obviously, the computer's programmed to try and make you think it's a human, so its answer would be no. Bella, now we're getting a little bit more deep. Favorite color, favorite place they visited, funny events. So right, things I would think of asking questions like, tell me one of your earliest memories, what is your greatest fears, have you ever been in love, how did that feel, what is the experience of loss like to you, can you tell me about something that really hurt you, I don't know. And maybe you would think that if you got a robotic enough kind of weird, artificial sounding response, then that would be the giveaway that would let you be able to make the correct determination. So anyways, when we had a face-to-face version of this class, you know, like every other semester ever, I would actually play the imitation game with you guys, because we're much closer to the fulfillment of Turing's dream today in 2020 than when he wrote this in 1950, okay? It's kind of a visionary essay to write in 1950, because computers barely even existed at that time. It's in the infancy stages of the whole field. And if you know anything about those old ancient computers in the 50s and 60s, some of them would be like as big as a garage, you know, and have less processing power than like a pocket calculator or something. But at any rate, he thought that yes, as technology advances, we'll get to that stage where you just couldn't tell the difference, no matter what questions you asked, between the two interview subjects. Nowadays, 2020, we have much more sophisticated artificial intelligence, and there is actually a prize, an international competition every year, which is called the Loebner Prize. Just so that you know, I'll put the name of that here. Not the hugest piece of info for us, but the Loebner competition is where the most advanced artificial intelligence labs from around the world doing research try to use their chatbots that they've developed to put the Turing test out there and see if the machine can pass it. Still to this day, we have not quite been able to develop an artificial intelligence system that can systematically and reliably pass the Turing test, because a sophisticated enough, a skilled enough interrogator is still capable of making the correct call in most of the cases, but the accuracy rate of those judgments is getting lower over time. And Turing thought that when we get to the point where it's basically a 50-50, you know, so it's sort of just a random guess, you get half the time right, half the time wrong, that's when we should say you just can't tell the difference and machines have consciousness. The most powerful, realistic, kind of and also a little spooky chatbot that you can interact with, the one that's been winning the Loebner Prize every year for like the past 4 or 5 years, is a chatbot that's name is Mitsuku. So if you want to have one of these weird, realistic type of conversations with a machine, robot, computer, you can look up Mitsuku, and it's very interesting. It's easy for a person to get an app where you can just chat with it. And it gets more sophisticated every year and a little bit more realistic in terms of the questions that it's able to respond to and the way it responds. In fact, like in previous semesters, I will actually conduct the test. So I get on my phone and I tell the students in the class, ask me a question that you want to pose to the interview subject. And I just don't tell them in which case they're talking to a human and in which case they're talking to the chatbot. And then I ask the students at the end, you know, tell me, did you think the first individual was the robot or the second? And there's been cases where like about half of the students got the wrong response because of how deceptively human-like these current day chatbots are becoming. And if you look at the timescales of technological advancement that seem to be shortening and shortening, it's not, I don't think, impossible for these current day chatbots to be way more impressive in the next 20, 30, 40 years. If you look back at computers from 30 years ago, people playing, you know, Mario Brothers and stuff, compared to like current day video games, we've seen a huge revolution just in that realm. So who's to say that, you know, we won't be on the forefront of a huge computing revolution over the next century where, yeah, there's more realistic interaction between you and those machines. So anyway, that's the game, and that's what he thinks would be the method to determine whether they have consciousness. Now, he says that, of course, there are objections to that. So some people, and I've already heard from some of you, object and say there's no way that a machine would ever have consciousness, no matter how well it did in this game. You know, even if it passed it with flying colors, it's not really consciousness because it doesn't actually feel anything, or, you know, it's just a computer program. Let's talk about those objections, because Turing tries to take them on and give some replies back. All right, so let me see which main objections I want to talk about. Okay. Okay, so various objections. By the way, his prediction was that when we got to around the turn of the century, the year 2000, so that's 50 years ahead of when he wrote this, he thought that the accuracy rate of the interrogator would be at something like 75%, and then it would just be a slow and steady march towards a 50% accuracy rate as the computers inevitably become more powerful, have increased storage capacity and power over the years. So in his view, it's not only possible for computers to think, he believed that it's within reach in the next few generations and that it will happen. But let's now hear some objections to that. So objections to Turing's whole idea here. And he labels these objections. So one he calls the mathematical objection. All right, so this objection basically just says that for certain technical reasons, certain mathematical reasons, there are certain questions that a machine would never be able to provide an answer to, unlike us. And therefore, that's showing that they would never really have consciousness. Okay, so for technical reasons, there are certain questions that the machine will be unable to answer, unlike humans, so they can't have consciousness. So that's one objection, the mathematical objection. As you see, it says that for technical reasons, there are certain questions the machine, the computer would never be able to answer, but we humans are not like that. We could always give an answer to a question, even if it's a weird question, but there's some questions that a computer would just not be able to even define an answer to, and that would be the indicator that they don't have actual consciousness. So for example, just a simple example. Well, first of all, let me tell you what these sort of technical reasons are. I won't be able to get into the details too much, but basically there was this famous logician and mathematician in the 20th century whose name was Kurt Gödel, G-O-D-E-L. Gödel, but in the German with the umlaut over the O, Gödel. Anyway, Kurt Gödel, he published a very important mathematical proof and theorem, which is called the incompleteness theorem, sometimes referred to as the undecidability theorem. And it just basically means that within any formal system, like a mathematical or computer programming language, there will be certain questions that cannot be answered within the system itself. As a trivial case of this, think about if you have a calculator and you ask the calculator to perform this operation. You give it a positive number, and then you ask it to divide that by 0. It won't return a result because that's an undefined operation in math. So you could argue that if you ask a machine certain questions that go outside the scope of its programming, or that it does not have a defined rule in terms of what output to give, then it will either give you no response or it will just time out. But a human being presented with a similar question would be able to formulate some type of answer. And therefore, maybe machines don't have consciousness because of these mathematical limitations that they've got. What is Turing's reply to that? Okay, so Turing's reply. So I'm going to have to clear the board, obviously, to write the reply, but the reply is associated with this objection. Okay, so his reply is pretty clever. He says, actually, we are no different than that. We are the same. There are also questions that the human brain is not going to be capable of answering either. And we just don't think much about those questions that are way out on the limits of our human ability to understand, but they are there. So he says, we are the same. There are certain questions that we cannot answer either. Okay, so like if I ask you, for example, what's the biggest number? You really can't give me an answer. Your first attempt might be, well, infinity. But what we've learned in set theory is that if you take an infinite set and then you raise it to the next power, meaning that you take all the subsets that are possible within that set, then you have a larger infinity. So like the cardinality of the natural numbers is infinite, but if you take the power set of that natural numbers, then you get a second infinity, which is uncountably infinite. So you could simply reify that and continue to take the power set of the power set of the power set. So I mean, it seems as if your mind is boggled and unable to give an credible answer. Same with if I asked you what's the lowest, smallest number. There's no real way to consider that, because for any number you think, it can be further subdivided and the decimal expansion increased. More zeros added, basically. What if I ask you, does the universe have a beginning or not? You're kind of also going to have a mind-boggled response, because if you think about it, both responses that are possible seem kind of absurd. If it's been there forever, then it has no beginning. How is that possible? On the other hand, if it started from nothing, then it's something coming from nothing, and that seems to violate like laws of physics and the conservation of matter. So there's some questions, he says, that we also would just have to scratch our head and say, I don't know, I got to get back to you. That's something I really don't have a clear answer for. So when we're pressed up against the limits of the human brain, we find that there's certain questions that we're incapable of dealing with. Ask it anything in philosophy, Trevor? I don't know. I mean, if it's a very, very sophisticated computer, maybe it would be able to have that chat with you. You got to remember, we're not talking just about current day computers. We're talking about all possible future computers. And Turing was too. Of course, he wasn't talking about the garage-sized calculator computer that existed in 1950 when he wrote that. He's a visionary who's projecting into the future that computers will eventually be able to imitate human behavior to such a qualitative extent that you will have no basis to deny that they're conscious just like us. Okay, so that's one objection and one reply. The mathematical objection, his essential response is that we're kind of like those computers because we also have computational and certain limitations in terms of what we can respond to and answer. Okay, so another objection. I skipped over one part of the essay because just for the sake of time constraints, but I could mention it very briefly as a side note. He talks about how the digital computer is what's called a discrete state machine, and he says the human computer, basically the human brain, is very similar to the digital computer because it operates according to similar principles. He talks about how in the digital computer there's a central processing unit, then there's a storage bin, a storage basis which has all of the information and instructions written within it, and then there's a control which allows the instructions to be carried out in a specific logical order. And he says that's kind of similar to the human brain, which has a repository of information, that's like its data storage, and then the control unit, which allows us to carry those things out in a given order. And he also talks about how a discrete state machine is a machine that's in one definite state at any given time, with each new state a function of the previous state plus an input signal. So let me get back to your questions. I see the chat lighting up a little, so let me look at that. Marissa, you say, but isn't it different because the computer is being told what it likes rather than forming its own opinion? Good objection, and we'll get to that in a minute because Turing thinks about that as well. And Trevor, you say, well, no, machine learning helps avoid someone actually controlling the computer for it to formulate a response. AI can learn over time. Yeah, I mean, it's a possibility, right? There could be machines that have a program which allow them to acquire new bits of information that go beyond the initial parameters of the program language that they were given. So you could build thinking machines that could acquire new information, but those are all aspects of current day artificial intelligence research. Let's get into the next objection. All I was going to say at the end there about the discrete state machines, though, is that the state it's in at one time depends on its previous state plus an input signal. A trivial case of that would be like, see my cell phone right now, it's set to off. If I hit the power button, you see the lock screen. And if I swipe my finger, we're at the home screen. For example, why is the home screen the state that this computer displays right now? Because the previous state was lock screen, and the input was given by means of my finger scrolling over the screen. That leads to this new state of the system. If you, let's say, do an internet search on Alan Turing, when you hit return and you see the results show up on the screen, displaying these results is because the previous state of the system was search bar had Turing in it, and input signal was hitting the enter key, which now displays this new state. So with discrete state machines, the number of states that they're capable of displaying has an impact on how sophisticated the program can possibly be. Today we have video games, etc., with vastly numerous number of discrete states. So when you like defeat the boss, the input given by means of the controller or keyboard, plus the fact that you were just engaged in battle with the boss, provides the next unlocked element or screen in the gaming experience. So can discrete state machines ever do well enough in the imitation game to reliably trick the interrogator? This is like a more nuanced way, I guess, of posing the question. And of course, as he says, he thinks that could happen. All right, so another objection. This is the objection from consciousness. Okay, this is one that maybe is on some of your minds, as you think about this concept. So the objection from consciousness is basically that the machine itself does not have actual consciousness, no matter how well it does in the machine, no matter how well it does in this game, even if it really tricks you quite often, it's not real consciousness because it doesn't actually have any feelings or experiences on the inside. It's just input-output behavior. The system receives an input in terms of a question posed to it, and then that gives it a stimulus to output a specific bit of written information. But there's no like cognitive activity going on inside. There's no light on inside, as it were. It's just an input-output system. So it's not really feeling or thinking. It's just behaving as though it is. That's another possible objection. So no matter how well the machine does in the game, okay, so no matter, according to this objection, no matter how well it does in the game, suppose that it's talking to you just like your best friend, and it's having the most sensitive, human-like conversation with you. No matter how well that does it, it's still not real consciousness because on the inside, this computer is not like us, not actually having thoughts, feelings, hopes, dreams, fears. It's just exhibiting behavior on the basis of a program. So you can argue that's not real consciousness. But once again, Alan Turing is ready to reply to that. So let me just say, there's only a couple of things left on this Alan Turing. So as we're running close to the end of class, I just wanted to finish it off in a thorough way. So on Monday, I'll take maybe the first 10, 15 minutes of the meeting to kind of finalize these notes on Turing. So make sure that we keep that in mind as we go through our weekend. But let me just speak about his reply here, and maybe I'll have to continue on this point from here with the last few objections as we return on Monday. But I'll just talk us through the reply for now so that I can get it in without having to use too much time writing on the board. His response to this is kind of creative. He says, okay, well, what makes you think that anybody is conscious? Like, how do you know that, for example, other human beings have consciousness? Because after all, you're not them, you're you. You can't prove that they have consciousness by being them and feeling their consciousness from their first-person perspective, because you only have the first-person perspective of one person. Remembering Descartes, you just have your own first-person perspective. You're you. You're not anyone else. So when it comes to other human beings having consciousness, the only way that you can judge that they have it is based on the behavior that they exhibit. Because if you're waiting to have a clearer proof, like being them and feeling their thoughts and experiences from the inside, that's never going to happen, because you're permanently locked away into the confines of your own psychology and consciousness. You can't inhabit another person's. So what he's saying essentially is the only conceivable test or judgment that you can make for having consciousness is the behavior that something exhibits. And so if the behavior itself, by means of its responses, is indistinguishable from human interaction and behavior, why should we deny that it has consciousness? He says if you do deny it, that makes it seem like you're so skeptical that anything else has consciousness besides yourself that you're almost like a solipsist. Like, how do I know that any other minds exist? So I don't know if that's the most powerful response, because you could argue, well, of course it's going to behave as though it has consciousness. That's the whole point of programming it as such. But Turing really doesn't see a huge discrepancy between the human brain, which he calls the human computer, and the digital computer, which of course we create. So the behavior is the only thing you can look at. You can't get on the inside of the consciousness to verify it from that perspective. So if the behavior is the only available criteria to judge, then when the behavior becomes indistinguishable, that should be what leads to your judgment that it does have consciousness. Okay, so there's that. And then, yeah, I was just going to talk to you about a couple more. There's the argument from various disabilities, and then the objection called Lady Lovelace's objection. He had this friend named Lady Lovelace that would sometimes debate these matters with him, and he gives her a little shout out in the paper, and he says, here, I want to talk to you guys about an objection she told me about. And then he responds back to her, and hers is very good. It's the objection that the machine can only do what it has been programmed to do. Isn't that different from us? We can do things totally spontaneous that don't have anything to do with our previous behavior, but the computer is locked into a program. So does that show it doesn't have real consciousness? Okay, well, stay tuned, and we'll get answers, hopefully, to these other questions on Monday. But until then, have a great weekend. Stay safe. Next week, I'll be distributing the study guide questions for the final at some point during the week, maybe midweek. And then you can start looking at those and getting your thoughts settled for the final that's coming up later. But for now, anyway, have a good weekend, and take care. Let me know if you need anything. And I'll see you guys back on Monday then. All right, bye-bye.